Imagine a truck driver in Berlin on a cold morning, filling his van with diesel. He's watching the numbers on the pump climb relentlessly, probably muttering about politicians and global conflicts making his job harder. He believes he's doing his part, paying a premium for fuel that doesn't come from Russia, supporting the Western sanctions. But what if I told you the journey of that very diesel almost certainly began in a Russian port? That was loaded onto a tanker, sailed thousands of miles to a massive refinery in India, transformed into diesel, and then shipped right back to Europe to end up in his tank. This isn't some fictional loophole. It's a multi-billion-dollar trade route that's booming. The same European nations that publicly condemn Russian oil are quietly becoming one of the biggest buyers of Indian refined fuels, which are made from that very same discounted Russian crude. So how did India, a nation where the average person earns less than $3,000 a year, position itself as the indispensable middleman in this tangled global energy game? And why does the West, despite its tough talk, seem to let it happen? Okay, let's unpack this. We've looked into the economics, the geopolitical maneuvering, and also the really innovative logistics involved in this massive trade. We're talking about a commercial decision, sure, but one with profound strategic implications for global finance, for energy security.
Exactly. And this deep dive, it's about understanding not just the sheer volume, which is frankly staggering, but why. Why did India position itself this way? And what about the immense pressure and, let's be honest, the benefits that came with it? We should probably frame our conversation around, say, 3 key perspectives that really guide New Delhi's strategy. First, the core economic impact, how it affects the average Indian citizen. Second, the strategic calculus, the foreign policy thinking. And third, the ingenious mechanisms keeping the oil flowing despite all the international scrutiny.
Right, and this is where we get past the headlines into the operational reality. We're talking about a strategy that touches, everything. From household budgets in Mumbai, like you said, all the way to naval intelligence trying to track clandestine shipments out on the high seas. So for you, the listener, you're about to get the shortcut to understanding what might be the biggest energy arbitrage play of the decade. So let's start with the core economics. To really get this, we need to think about someone like Prakash, let's say, a delivery driver in Mumbai. Now, Prakash probably isn't following international oil futures, but he absolutely tracks the price at the pump. That's his bottom line. For him, stable, maybe even discounted fuel means stability. It means, the difference between providing for his family and having to cut back on essentials. So what were those initial economic benefits, and why was this discounted Russian oil such an immediate, almost urgent necessity for a fast-growing economy like India?
Well, the necessity really stems from a fundamental vulnerability. India depends on imports for nearly 85% of its crude oil needs. That's huge. And to keep its rapid economic growth going, which just demands reliable, affordable energy, it simply had to find a cheaper supply when global prices went through the roof.
And the change where they got their oil from, it was incredibly fast and dramatic, wasn't it?
Oh, it was a monumental shift. Happened virtually overnight, it felt like. Before all the geopolitical disruption in 2022, Russian crude was barely a factor, less than 2% of India's total oil imports. Honestly, it was just geographically inconvenient, logistically expensive. But then sanctions hit, Russian Urals crude started trading at a major discount, and Indian refiners, they jumped at the opportunity. Both the state-owned ones and the big private players like Reliance.
How high did those import numbers actually climb?
They surged, really surged, stabilized around 35, maybe 40% of India's total monthly imports. We're talking roughly 1.6 million barrels per day. Just think about that. And the speed of it meant Russia didn't just become a significant supplier, it became India's largest single supplier, pushing aside traditional players from the Middle East like Iraq and Saudi Arabia who just couldn't or wouldn't offer those kinds of discounts.
Wow, and that initial shift, it must have translated pretty much immediately into a massive financial windfall for the country, right?
Yeah.
Can you put some numbers on that? Help us picture the scale of the savings.
Yeah, analysts estimate India saved quite a bit since 2022. The numbers range, but somewhere between, say, $10 billion and maybe a high-end estimate of $25 billion. Now, $25 billion, that's not just a number on a spreadsheet. That money translates directly into fiscal policy space. It gives the government room to breathe. And to bring it back to Prakash, those savings meant the government had less pressure to subsidize fuel prices domestically, which directly helped keep a lid on inflation for petrol and diesel. And for the bigger picture, the national economy, it definitely improved the trade balance by cutting the overall import bill. Plus, it conserved precious foreign exchange reserves.
So the stability Prakash feels or felt at the pump is a direct result of these deep discounts. It must have also had a huge impact on the refiners themselves.
Absolutely. The savings weren't just on the national books. They really boosted the competitiveness, the margins for the refiners. Suddenly, India's refining sector had access to crude oil input at a significant advantage over their global competitors, which, positioned them perfectly for that lucrative re-export market we'll get into later.
Okay, but the picture isn't all rosy now. We're hearing that the initial, almost unbelievable windfall, it's starting to fade. That what started as this massive financial advantage is narrowing quite quickly. Why is that discount eroding so fast?
Yeah, and this is the really critical piece now. It makes New Delhi's ongoing calculation much, much riskier. That golden age of steep discounts, it seems to be waning. There are a few interconnected reasons. If you look at the numbers, the discount India got on Russian crude compared to, say, benchmark West Asian crude, it was huge in the 2024 fiscal year. We saw gaps up to 14% sometimes. That 14% difference, it generated estimated annual savings of about $8.2 billion.
That's substantial. And what are we seeing now?
Well, the latest data for the 2025 fiscal year shows that discount has roughly halved, down to around 7%, and that cuts the potential annual savings down to maybe $3.8 billion, based on estimates. That drop from over $8 billion down to under $4 billion, that's a massive change in just a matter of months.
Why such a quick adjustment? Is it just Russia demanding a better price now?
That's definitely part of it, yes. Russia is adjusting its export pricing. They need to offset revenue losses from their traditional Western markets. But there are two other strong factors at play. First, the logistics costs. Freight and insurance have become much tighter, much more expensive. As Western maritime services step back because of sanctions, India has to rely on less efficient, more costly alternatives. That increases the final landed cost of the oil. And second, India isn't the only buyer looking for a bargain anymore. There's increased competition for Russian oil among other non-Western buyers, especially China. That competition is driving up the floor price.
Right. Sounds like a classic market correction. But didn't one brokerage report mention something specific about the net benefit? That maybe the headline savings figures were a bit exaggerated when you factor in these rising logistical costs.
That's exactly right. Some analysts did a really detailed breakdown, and they found that the actual net annual economic benefit, once you account for everything, was far smaller than those initial really optimistic headline numbers. They found India was increasingly absorbing these hidden costs. Higher insurance premiums, sometimes called a sanctions risk premium, and definitely higher freight costs linked to using that older, more opaque dark fleet we'll talk about. So when you factor in all these rising operational expenses, that potential $25 billion windfall looks much more like a limited short-term gain that's now, rapidly shrinking.
So Prakash, our delivery driver, might find his hard-won stability challenged again pretty soon if that price advantage disappears completely. The economic cushion is getting thinner, which really shifts the focus onto the geopolitical tightrope India is walking.
Exactly. This dwindling economic edge forces us to think about it from the perspective of someone like, let's call her Meera, a bureaucrat in New Delhi. Her job involves balancing the nation's immense energy needs against intense diplomatic pressure. This whole policy shift, it's not just about cheaper oil anymore, not primarily. It's become a high-stakes assertion of India's strategic autonomy in what's clearly an increasingly fragmented, multipolar world.
Can you help us define strategic autonomy in this specific context? What does that phrase really mean for India's energy policy decisions?
Sure. For New Delhi, strategic autonomy essentially means prioritizing their own sovereign national choices over aligning with any single external power bloc, especially when it comes to vital domestic needs like energy security. Their stance is rooted in, pragmatic necessity. They have 1.4 billion people. They must provide reliable and affordable energy supplies. And they argue they'll purchase that energy from whoever offers the best terms, regardless of Western sanctions regimes that they don't formally recognize.
So they're essentially resisting pressure, refusing to sacrifice domestic economic stability for what they might see as geopolitical posturing that doesn't actually serve the average Indian citizen. They view these procurement decisions as independent foreign policy.
Precisely. And they're quick to highlight what they see as hypocrisy from the West. India often points out that many G7 nations are still trading with Russia in various non-oil sectors. Things like strategic materials, certain natural gas deals continue, while at the same time, these countries are demanding India completely stop buying Russian oil. So for policymakers like Meera, it's about protecting national interests and refusing to let distant conflicts dictate their domestic fiscal health.
Okay, but this independent stance, it hasn't gone unnoticed. It's invited a pretty massive response, particularly from the United States, which seems to be using India's export economy as leverage to try and force compliance. That pressure campaign has really escalated, hasn't it?
Oh, it's moved far beyond just diplomatic chatter. The U.S. campaign has targeted India's export sector directly, and that sector is a huge employer, a key engine for India's growth. It started with an initial 25% punitive tariff slapped onto certain high-value Indian exports going to the United States.
And it didn't stop at 25%.
No, it didn't. That first hit was quickly followed by an executive order scheduling a full implementation of another 25% tariff. That brings the total punitive rate to a staggering 50% on certain imports, scheduled for late August 2025. Make no mistake, this is a deliberate, massive economic hammer being wielded to try and force compliance.
50% is basically pricing those goods out of the U.S. market entirely. What specific sectors are getting hit the hardest? And what's the U.S. justification for being so aggressive against a country they often call a strategic partner?
Well, the tariffs initially targeted sectors where India is quite competitive. Things like specialized carpets, certain textiles, furniture. Crucially, U.S. officials have publicly used some pretty harsh language, characterizing India's actions as profiteering from the Ukraine conflict. That term is clearly intended to delegitimize India's position. The explicit goal they've stated is to force India to cut back or completely eliminate its Russian oil imports by showing them the clear, massive economic cost of circumventing Western sanctions. And what's really striking is that this tension is happening even as the U.S. is simultaneously investing heavily in cultivating India as a vital strategic counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific. It really shows the absolute priority the U.S. is placing on enforcing these sanctions.
Yeah, that conflict puts immense pressure on officials like Mira. She must be constantly running the numbers on the alternative. What would the actual cost be if India just gave in, if they completely cut off that roughly 1.6 million barrels per day of Russian crude they're currently importing?
The consequences would be felt globally, yes, but the domestic costs for India would be truly severe. Let's look globally first. If that Russian crude can't easily find other buyers, if it effectively exits the supply chain, energy analysts suggest global oil prices could jump. Maybe 10% to 15%. That could potentially push Brent crude up towards $75, maybe $80 per barrel.
A global price shock, certainly. But you're saying the domestic impact for India would be even worse.
Substantially worse. Research, for example, from institutions like the State Bank of India estimates that cutting off Russian crude would inflate India's annual national fuel import bill by somewhere between $9 billion and maybe $11.7 billion. Annually. And linking this back to Prakash and inflation, that price shock would inevitably get passed down to consumers. Estimates suggest a 4% to 6% rise in domestic fuel prices just from the supply shift. That alone could add another 8 to 12 basis points to headline inflation.
And for our listeners, when we talk about basis points, even fractions of a percentage point, they seem small, but they have a huge cumulative effect. On the cost of everything, transport, food, basics. That's a direct threat to the stability Prakash relies on.
Exactly. It would ripple through the entire supply chain, it would hit household budgets hard, and create significant political and fiscal headaches for New Delhi. And beyond that, the refiners themselves face a specific technical headache. They've spent time, money, effort optimizing their complex operations to efficiently process that heavy Russian Urals crude. Switching abruptly to, say, lighter U.S. crudes or different Middle Eastern blends. That requires complex, time-consuming, and expensive reconfiguration of their equipment catalytic crackers, distillation columns. You can't just swap the input feed overnight and expect the same results, the same high-value product yields.
So the economic shock, plus this immense political risk from the U.S., it really leaves New Delhi in a tough spot. How have Mira and her colleagues responded? They haven't completely abandoned the Russian oil, clearly, but they have made some strategic countermoves.
Well, India has maintained its public stance of defiance, asserting its autonomy. But behind the scenes, pragmatism dictates they need to mitigate the risks. So, while they haven't fully complied with Western demands, they have made what you might call token gestures. They've slightly reduced the Russian crude volumes from their absolute peak, maybe from around 1.8 million barrels per day, down to the current range of 1.4 to 1.6 million.
But the more significant response seems to be proactive diversification and building resilience.
Precisely. They're strategically increasing purchases from alternative suppliers to minimize their exposure if things get worse. U.S. crude imports, for instance, have surged up a remarkable 114% year over year. They now account for about 8% of India's total needs. They're also boosting volumes from other stable, non-sanctioned sources like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and even Brazil.
And crucially, they're investing in making their refining infrastructure more adaptable.
Yes, absolutely. India is accelerating significant investment in refining expansion. For example, there's a $2.09 billion upgrade happening at Indian Oil Corporation's Gujarat refinery. The main goal here is to enhance the operational flexibility of these facilities. They want to ensure their plants can handle a wider variety of crudes, from the heavier Russian Urals they're used to now to lighter grades from the US or Nigeria, without a major hit to efficiency. This technical flexibility, you could argue, is the ultimate expression of strategic autonomy in the energy sphere, being able to adapt quickly.
Okay, so all the strategic maneuvering we've just discussed, it would all be purely theoretical if the oil couldn't actually be moved and paid for, right? The discounted oil coming in, the refined products going out, it all relies on these highly innovative and, let's face it, often highly risky methods to bypass Western financial controls and maritime services. This brings us to the perspective of someone like Samir, let's say, a veteran ship pilot working perhaps in Gujarat, who brings these, well, clandestine vessels into port. He sees the ghost ships up close.
Yeah, Samir's perspective really represents the physical manifestation of this entire geopolitical strategy. This trade absolutely relies on an invisible infrastructure, one built specifically to circumvent the global dominance of the US dollar system and Western shipping insurance. Without these operational workarounds, let's be clear, the sanctions would likely be devastatingly effective.
Let's start with the money side then. How has India managed to insulate this multi-billion-dollar trade from the US dollar and the threat of Western financial sanctions?
They've had to innovate, and fast. The main financial tool they're using involves something called SRVAs, that stands for Special Rupee Vostro accounts. You can think of a Vostro account as a specific kind of bank account that an Indian bank opens for a foreign correspondent bank, in this case, usually a Russian bank.
Okay, and how does that mechanism actually bypass the US dollar?
Well, it allows the transactions for the oil itself, the actual purchase, to be settled directly in Indian rupees. So the Russian exporter gets paid in rupees, deposited into their SRVA held at an Indian bank, rather than needing the transaction to go through the global SWIFT system in dollars, which is heavily monitored and essentially controlled by Western institutions. This dramatically cuts down the reliance on the US dollar, and it also sidesteps things like conversion costs and the exchange rate volatility that comes with dollar transactions. And importantly, the Reserve Bank of India recently streamlined the paperwork, the administrative process for opening these SRVAs. That's a clear signal they want to accelerate this rupee-based trade settlement.
That solves the immediate payment transfer problem.
Yeah.
But you mentioned India imports way more from Russia than it exports to them. So Russia must be quickly accumulating huge amounts of surplus rupees in these accounts. What's the point for Russia if they can't spend those rupees easily? How is that accumulation challenge being handled?
Yeah, that's probably the trickiest part of this whole de-dollarization push. And the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, has offered a solution, or at least a potential solution. They're allowing those surplus rupee balances sitting in the SRVAs to be invested back into Indian financial instruments. Specifically, Russia can deploy those rupees into Indian government securities, corporate bonds, even the Indian equity markets, and also some earmarked infrastructure projects.
Oh, okay. So Russia gets some kind of return on its accumulated rupees, and India effectively gets passive foreign investment directed towards its long-term growth goals.
That's the theory, yes. This mechanism tries to address the reaccumulation problem by giving Russia a way to use the currency beyond just simple trade. But there's a significant trade-off here. Many of these assets, particularly things like infrastructure bonds, aren't very liquid. They're hard to convert quickly back into dollars or euros if Russia suddenly needs those funds elsewhere internationally. So accumulating these rupees represents a calculated risk Russia is taking to keep the oil trade flowing, essentially betting on the long-term value and stability of the Indian economy. And it's worth adding, payments aren't only happening in rupees. They're also routing payments using third currencies, like the UAE dirham or sometimes the Chinese yuan, to further minimize reliance on just the rupiable mechanism and diversify away from the dollar even more.
And we have real-world examples of Indian companies, even those with direct Russian ownership ties, relying heavily on this kind of financial insulation, right?
Absolutely. A textbook case is Nayara Energy. It's partly owned by Russia's Rosneft. After the sanctions hit, their traditional global banks basically refused to process payments for their Russian crude imports. They were too afraid of secondary sanctions. So Nayara had to negotiate specifically with UCO Bank, which is an Indian state-owned bank with relatively limited international exposure. They managed to process these payments using the SRVA route. By using a bank that wasn't deeply tangled up in the Western financial system, they successfully found a way around the most crippling parts of the EU sanctions, at least for those transactions.
Okay, so that covers the money side. No, let's talk logistics actually moving the oil. Samir, our pilot, sees these ships, the ghost ships. What exactly is this shadow fleet we keep hearing about?
Right, the shadow fleet, sometimes called the dark fleet. It's essentially a sophisticated, quite clandestine network of vessels, and it's absolutely essential for moving sanctioned cargo like Russian oil. Industry estimates put the size of this network somewhere between 1,200 and maybe 1,600 vessels, mostly older tankers. That could be up to a fifth, maybe 20% of the entire global tanker fleet. It's enormous. Since 2022, it's estimated Russia itself has invested heavily, maybe around $10 billion, specifically in acquiring and building up this capability. And now they likely control a dark fleet that accounts for something like 70% of their seaborne crude exports.
Wow, a fifth of the global tanker fleet operating in the shadows. That's a huge operational challenge. What are the specific tactics Samir might witness that allow these vessels to evade detection and tracking so effectively?
They use a kind of multi-layered system of deception. First, they often operate using flags of convenience. That means registering vessels in countries like Panama, Liberia, or maybe small island nations that have minimal regulatory oversight. They also use complex shell companies to hide the true ownership, which is often linked back to Russia. Second, and this is probably the most visible tactic, they engage in going dark. That means deliberately disabling or tampering with their automatic identification system, their AIS transponders.
And the AIS, that's like the ship's license plate and location beacon, right? It's mandatory for safe navigation.
Exactly. Disabling it is a serious breach of maritime safety rules, but it allows them to effectively disappear from tracking systems, obscuring their movements. A pilot like Samir would need to be extremely cautious bringing in a vessel that suddenly pops back onto the radar after being dark for a long time. And third, they frequently conduct ship-to-ship transfers. This involves transferring cargo, like crude oil, from one vessel to another, often covertly out in remote international waters. This practice deliberately muddies the water, obscuring the crude's true origin, who owns it, or where it's ultimately headed. It makes a sanctioned cargo look like it might have come from a legitimate, non-sanctioned seller.
And because India itself doesn't adhere to unilateral Western sanctions, Indian refiners like Nayara Energy can actually utilize this shadow fleet without fearing penalties from their own government. It creates the perfect logistical pathway for this trade.
Precisely. The sheer scale and the sophistication of this whole system, from the financial workarounds like the SRVAs, all the way to the physical logistics involving the dark fleet, it really demonstrates the practical limits of unilateral Western sanctions. It clearly highlights how the global system, often driven by pure economic necessity, is adapting rapidly to maintain critical energy flows, even under intense political pressure.
So this whole invisible infrastructure brings us right back full circle to that paradox we started with the Berlin truck driver. India buys the heavily discounted Russian crude, processes it in its refineries, and then turns around and re-exports the refined product, often sending it right back into the very European markets that officially banned Russian crude in the first place.
Yes, this is the massive arbitrage play that's generating billions for Indian refiners. They capitalize on that deep discount, even if it's narrowing now, and they process the heavy Russian Urals crude into high-value petroleum products. We're talking about products with huge global demand. Diesel, jet fuel, petrol.
So, India has essentially become the world's refining hub for sanctioned crude, leveraging a geopolitical crisis to turn a discounted input into a highly profitable export commodity on a massive scale.
It's a spectacular example of regulatory arbitrage, really. You see, EU and US sanctions primarily target the origin of the crude oil itself, but they often contain exemptions for refined products if the original crude has undergone what they call substantial transformation in a third country. India's modern state-of-the-art refineries provide precisely that transformation, and the paradox is quite acute. European nations, while maintaining their official public condemnation of Russian oil, have become major buyers of these Indian refined fuels. They are, in effect, swapping direct Russian crude imports for diesel and jet fuel that originated as Russian crude, ensuring their economies stay fueled while sticking to the letter, if perhaps not the spirit, of their own sanctions regime.
That seems like a pretty clever, if maybe delicate, business model for India, capitalizing on this loophole. But relying so heavily on Russian crude as the input must introduce significant indirect geopolitical risks for India's wider export industries, right? Compounding that U.S. tariff threat we talked about earlier.
The risk is definitely multi-layered. While the U.S. currently exempts refined petroleum products from its recent 50% tariff escalation, At least for now, the looming threat of secondary sanctions or maybe specific penalty tariffs targeting refined products derived from Russian oil, that remains probably New Delhi's biggest headache. If the US or the EU decided to close this specific loophole, Indian refiners would suddenly face much higher compliance costs, potentially restricted access to key Western markets, and a significant devaluation of their primary advantage, that discounted crude feedstock.
And we know this high-stakes game is already forcing Indian businesses, even outside the oil sector, to urgently look for ways to reduce their dependence on the U.S. market specifically.
That's the compounding effect of the U.S. pressure, exactly. The general threat of punitive tariffs, which has hit non-oil sectors hard, for instance. There were threats of tariffs up to 200% proposed for certain pharmaceutical exports, is forcing Indian exporters to aggressively seek out new, high-potential alternative markets. Sectors that were heavily reliant on the U.S., like textiles, carpets, furniture, they are now urgently trying to diversify their customer base, focusing more on places like Sweden, Australia, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and the U.K. This isn't long-term strategy. This is an immediate operational response to mitigate the very real risk of losing margins and market access due to this geopolitical tension. So what we've ultimately seen here is, it's a complex and frankly highly effective dance. India's strategic national interests, primarily ensuring energy security and controlling inflation for 1.4 billion people, successfully leveraged a major global disruption, the sanctions, through a combination of economic pragmatism and real logistical ingenuity. This intricate strategy relied entirely on those financial solutions like the rupee-based SRVAs and the kind of high seas maneuvering enabled by the dark fleet.
Yeah, India has really cemented itself, maybe unintentionally at first, as the world's indispensable energy arbitrage hub. And in doing so, it's simultaneously challenging the dominance of the US dollar by promoting alternative payment systems and carving out a crucial economic sphere for itself somewhat outside direct Western financial controls. This high-stakes maneuvering really confirms that for a country with India's immense growth demands and population size, securing affordable energy for its citizens will, perhaps inevitably, always override distant geopolitical alignments.
And I think it's important to stress this situation probably isn't just a temporary anomaly caused by current events. It feels like it's fundamentally shifting the global trade architecture. It's accelerating the development of more robust, non-Western energy trade networks and alternative payment systems. These precedents being set now, they're likely to shape energy geopolitics for years to come, long after this immediate crisis fades, establishing new commercial realities and a much more fragmented global economy.